I'm David Spears. Welcome to Insiders. The opposition spent much of the week pursuing what it reckons is the first integrity scandal to hit the government. It claims Finance Minister Katy Gallagher misled Parliament when she denied any prior knowledge of the Brittany Higgins rape allegation before it was made public. Yesterday, the minister admitted she was aware of some allegations, but denies misleading Parliament. And Labor isn't sounding too troubled about the political heat over all this. But when it comes to the pressure building on households and the growing fears of a recession, well, that's another matter. The government is clearly worried. The Treasurer says the latest interest rate hike will be difficult to cop. And there's a clear divergence now between the Reserve Bank and the government over whether wage increases are making it harder to bring down inflation. Later in the program, I'll speak to the Aged Care Minister, Anika Wells, who warned this week that the baby boomers were coming and new ideas were needed to ensure the sustainability of the aged care sector. But first, the panel: Samantha Maiden, Jacob Grieber and Lenore Taylor. Taylor, very good morning to all of you. Let's start with what we've now seen, the 12th interest rate hike. Jacob, why did the Reserve Bank move on Tuesday?
I don't think Philip Lowe had much of a choice. Inflation's still way above the band. He's expressed concerns about the housing market picking up a little bit after it dipped, and he's looking forward to what's coming down the pike, and that's a whole bunch of wages pressure that's now in train. By nature, these rate hikes are, he's dealing with a problem that's coming rather than looking in the rear window.
He did also, I mean, it wasn't the only factor, but this Fair Work Commission decision last week to lift the minimum wage by 8.6% and award wages by 5.75%. It was, he made clear, a factor in the list that he gave.
It's not like we're just responding to the Fair Work Commission. We've seen developments overseas, the domestic inflation data, housing prices, the exchange rate, the Fair Work Commission decision, state government wages policies and the federal government wages. So there's a whole bunch of things, and when a whole bunch of things all point to the same direction, it suggests the risks are shifted, and in our risk management framework we respond to that.
Yeah, so that list did include the Fair Work Commission decision. The Treasurer, though, look, you know, he pointed out that that Philip Lowe wasn't too worried about that minimum wage increase.
I was pleased to see, frankly, the Reserve Bank Governor acknowledge today that the important increase to the minimum wage is not what is pushing up interest rates in his estimation, nor is it in my estimation.
Lenore, what's going on here? Is there a disagreement or a difference between the Treasurer and the RBA Governor on wages?
Yeah, to an extent I think that there is. I mean, the Governor, as you say, points to the minimum wage rise as one factor. That rise is still lower than inflation, so we do not have a wage price spiral going on. But the Governor is worried that if that flows through the rest of the economy, it will mean that inflation comes down more slowly. I guess if you're looking at it from the government's point of view, a wage rise of that amount gives struggling families, struggling with the interest rates that are being put up by the Reserve Bank, some hope of, eating. That kind of existential pressure is going to weigh more heavily in the minds of the government, possibly than the minds of the RBA. And probably it's about a difference about how quickly we should be bringing interest rates down and the pain that is acceptable in the community from doing that.
Yeah, on the wages, though, I think Phil Lowe said it's understandable the lowest paid do get compensation for inflation, so something around. He's worried about that spreading across the economy.
But spreading to families who are, mortgagees. I mean, everybody is feeling the pain right now.
And it's also worth noting that it's very, very unlikely, and the history tells us they're not going to get the same level of wage growth. But he clearly is more concerned than the government about this, though, right?
Yeah, but this is also the nature of the wicked problem of inflation, right? Because so many families, because of rising interest rates, need a pay rise. So there is going to be pressure in the system for that to happen. And it's pretty tough to say to people when they're spending, on average, sometimes somewhere between $500 to $1,000 a month extra on their mortgage. Of course, they're going to be looking for extra money. I mean, according to Philip Lowe, they should be looking for an extra job or a lodger. So, yeah.
And wages aren't the only thing that is fueling inflation. I mean, studies are showing that profit margins in some sectors are increasing as well. So there's other factors in.
But until now, wages haven't been really fueling inflation in a big way at all, and they've made that point for a very long time.
There's other evidence to the point. I'd point you to someone like Kieran Davis at Coolabah Capital, who's done some research into non-mining business, and up to 90% of them are saying wages are actually the main driver of inflation in those businesses. So this stuff, there is signs that this stuff's building, and it gets very quickly into a sort of fairness and moral argument. You know, families do need support, but they also, you know, did well when we didn't have inflation. And the problem for the government is they're fighting a battle that they set up before the last election, which was to go after weak wages growth. Incidentally, at a time when we had very, very low rates, historically speaking. You know, there was a connection there. Unfortunately, the fight has changed.
And
but wages growth has been below inflation for some time and remains below inflation.
Well, of course, because inflation has shot up. Like, of course, it's going to take a time it'll be below that for a while, and that's the argument Lowe's trying to explain to people.
Well, he's trying to dampen expectations, right? So don't expect to get everybody to get compensated for inflation. But that's something the government has difficulty in saying because, as you say, it was central to their election pledge, wasn't it? We're going to get real wages growth going. Problem is, inflation's so high now, anything above that is going to make the problem worse when productivity isn't moving. Now, productivity... it's become a very hot topic now, Jacob. I mean, Philip Lowe has been hammering this for a couple of weeks now. You can't have wage growth like this without any productivity. And we saw the figures this week. It's going down. And why is that? And what's the key? What's the answer?
Well, productivity is the sort of magic sauce that ensures you get the higher living standard without the inflation. And the problem is that there's been productivity growth in the resources sector, but the rest of the economy, it's been incredibly flat and now seems to be going down. And we saw the data last week showing unit labour costs are up something like 8%. That's pretty much almost 4 times what the Reserve Bank said it needs to go up to avoid inflation going up. So that's the problem for the government. And the quote you ran from Chalmers, you know, it's very specific. He's talking about the lowest of wage earners. Low is looking across the board at the whole sweep.
Yeah. And so the government would argue on productivity. They've got a bunch of things they're doing, whether it's on energy, whether it's on skills and training. And all of this takes time, though, to flow through to productivity improvement. You can't just, flick a switch on this stuff. What about their IR agenda, though, this same jobs, same pay legislation that we don't know all the details about? Is that going to help or hurt productivity?
Well, again, we're looking at only through the prism of wages. I mean, and there's a bunch of other things that can improve or affect productivity as well. I mean, I think the former ACCC chairman, Rod Sims, makes a good case that competition and merger laws are
Sure, but this is something the government's talking about introducing, so there's understandable focus on whether this is going to make the problem better or worse.
Well, I mean, it's basically just saying that people should get the same amount of pay for doing the same work. So it's a fundamental...
So does that improve productivity or not? Is it?
Well, I mean, I guess my point is I don't think we should only look at productivity through the prism of wages.
Yeah, what do you think?
Well, business is very worried about those changes because of the effect on productivity. It's loading up, more costs without there necessarily being a trade-off. And, the wage agreements we have seen, the productivity piece hasn't been part of that discussion. It's been, we need relief, immediate relief from higher costs. Now, you can get away with it for a period of time, but that's why we're in this situation and why the Reserve Bank is signalling they're not done yet, because they're cognizant of all of this stuff unfolding.
Sam, politically, the government obviously is pretty happy for Philip Lowe to wear as much heat over interest rates, and that's probably been the case, I think, to date. You do sense, though, talking to them on behind the scenes, there's growing frustration about what the Reserve Bank is doing now. Where does this go?
Well, the Reserve Bank is independent, as Jim Chalmers keeps telling us. And, of course, there's no, I think that Philip Lowe, bless him, is in his nothing left to lose mode, because he knows that, it's very unlikely that they're going to extend his term. I suppose that gives the Labor Party as well a bit of a political wriggle room to sort of, shovel the proverbial on this guy. But at the end of the day, I think there is an argument as well that they should have acted faster, the Reserve Bank. They didn't. They let interest rates stay too low for too long, and now we're paying the price. Yeah,
on this question of whether they get rid of Philip Lowe, well, his term is up in September. It's a question of whether they extend that term.
Yeah, which his two predecessors both got extension.
Exactly. It's pretty normal to get the extension. I don't think anyone's expecting he will.
I think once you start getting papped by the Daily Mail playing golf, I think your chances...
You're in trouble. Yeah. But are there risks here if they don't continue with Philip Lowe? Would someone new in the role do anything different?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm sure it'll feel good to throw the governor off the mount, you know, in a great sacrificial display, but it's not going to do much about appeasing the inflation god, if that's what we're talking about. The problem's still going to be there for whoever gets the job next. And I think, you know, Lowe did make mistakes with that sort of pandemic era setting.
Yeah.
But he's sure as hell fixing it, and he's doing his job. So the case for getting rid of him, I think, is problematic. It's not cut and dry. And whoever gets the job next sort of has that little asterisk hanging over them. You were appointed by the government that was unhappy with the last bloke.
I guess the best case scenario would be by then, by September, they're done with lifting rates, and whoever does come in, if Philip Lowe is thrown off the mount, won't have to raise them any further. But you just don't know, Lenore, do you?
You don't, and I guess from the government's point of view, we keep getting these metaphors about the narrow path that we have to walk to try and avoid recession. Well,
it's getting bumpy and
whatever. I mean, Philip Lowe's going to be gone, you know, and the government will be bearing the political cost of that if we don't manage to make it down that path.
Fair bit at stake on sticking to that path. Anyway, time to talk to the Aged Care Minister, Anika Wells, who's announced a new task force to quickly settle the best way to fund higher standards of care. Now, 2 years ago, the Aged Care Royal Commission recommended a levy on taxpayers. And leading up to the election, here was Labor's position on that idea.
We're not proposing a levy. That's not our proposal. It's not on our agenda. We haven't considered it.
A levy is not something that's in consideration at the moment.
The Aged Care Royal Commission did also recommend an aged care levy to help pay for these costs. Have you made a call on that one yet?
Yeah, we've said that we won't be going down that path, David. We've got other priorities in the budget.
Anika Wells, welcome to the program.
Good to be with you.
So as we saw there, Labor certainly wasn't considering a levy, an aged care levy, before the election. Now you are. What's changed? Why are you now open to the idea?
I think what I've put forward in the Aged Care Task Force this week is that we need to have an honest, responsible and mature discussion about what aged care is going to look like in this country. And if I'm setting up a task force that is going to answer the question of how do we sustainably, equitably fund aged care in Australia moving forward, we need to deliberate on the recommendations to aged care funding that were handed by the Royal Commission.
Which was 2 years ago, and in the years that followed, Labor, as we just saw, was very cool on the idea of a levy. Was that because you had an election to win?
I would say we're still not advocating any particular proposal. What we are saying is that we're opening up a task force, like you said, short, sharp, to deliberate for 6 months on how to move forward. I would say that proposal, along with plenty of others, have been suggested in about 20 years worth of governments not acting on the future of aged care. And now the time is to look at everything that has come before, deliberate and adjudicate.
Well, you're right. This has been talked about for a long time. Many would argue there's a real need to fix the funding of aged care one way or another. You've only been minister for 1 year, and here you are having a crack at this. Why is that? Why have so many been so reluctant to go down this path, and you're now willing to do it?
Well, for me, it's really personal. I spoke at the National Press Club about my mum working in aged care for the last 15 years before she retired. I worked in aged care alongside her for a few years at uni, and I saw then some of the problems that I saw again walking back into facilities at becoming the aged care minister this year. I think this is just one policy area that has been allowed to drift as too hard for decades and decades. And if we can't act after a Royal Commission that had an interim report titled Neglect, genuinely, when are we going to do it?
So the two Royal Commissioners had slightly different views on the best way to do a levy. What do you think? And I suppose, where do we need to start here? Will you tell the task force what funding is needed? Is that important to begin with? How much money is aged care going to require?
I think that would be putting the cart before the horse. I think where we're coming at this from the perspective, how do we lift the standard of care in this country? I said some guiding principles for me chairing the task force are going to be, how do we get better care into the system? How do we get better clarity into the system? Because people tell me every Saturday morning it is almost impenetrable. So a bunch of work for the task force to do, sure, on what the different proposals are and what they'll raise.
But if you need to raise, say, an extra $10 billion a year to deliver the services people want in aged care, well, some options are going to look better than others, right? A levy across the board, all taxpayers, might be where you have to go.
I think what we need out of this is for people to genuinely feel like they have a choice, whether that's a choice to stay at home for as long as possible, whether that's a choice to enter a particular model of residential aged care. I mean, there's some really innovative models out there in other countries starting to come into Australia, but how do I make policy settings that encourage investment and make it an environment that people want to invest in innovative?
So what are those models, those innovative models from overseas that you're talking about?
Yep, so there's kind of the village model, which initiated out of the Netherlands, the Hogwek, apologies for my Dutch model, where it's based around a village. People live in sort of houses that might occupy 6 or 7 people, like it's called a hearth in the Netherlands.
Right.
And then they have a restaurant or a gym or a village green, and they down in Tasmania there's one that uses cargo bikes to get people around, and they speak to much higher visitation rates of residents from their families because it's an environment that people want to come to, that grandkids don't feel is too institutional.
So is this the future of aged care? Because we've heard you talk about what we don't want to see.
Yeah.
Is this more home style, in between shared accommodation and in-home care? Is that sort of the future you're envisaging?
I hope so. And I think what people have told me is that innovation has been pretty stifled. There's no reward or incentive to do it apart from the goodness of your own heart. And there's other models for people where they've created inside a main street, a village environment that's very similar to the small town it lives in, where the hardware store's in the same place in relation to the grocery store. People have a house front, a porch, and then all of their healthcare practitioners operate through back corridors discreetly, and that creates efficiency as well if you can do that quickly.
I mean, it sounds wonderful, but it does sound expensive. So it gets us back to this issue of how you fund it. Are you open to a Medicare-style levy on all taxpayers?
As the chair of the task force, I do think we have a genuine duty to deliberate on the 2 particular recommendations of the Royal Commission. Whether or not that's to rule them out immediately, I think we owe them the respect of considering them. There are plenty of other proposals out there too. The sector itself called together a summit last week, and they're going to put a white paper up to the task force. Can't wait to read that. So I think it's just too soon.
Is this a way, particularly if you put a levy on higher income earners to pay for this, is this a way of clawing back some of the stage 3 tax cuts benefits that will flow to the top?
That is not my guiding principle setting out to do the task force. But the point that I think to the thrust of your question is that Australians are already paying more for aged care at the moment. It's a $34 billion bucket of money in the budget. Taxpayers are contributing huge amount for good reason. We've got to lift the standard of care. We put a $36 billion injection into aged care in the May budget. And on existing settings, because there already is means testing in aged care.
Well, yes, there is, but I wanted to ask you about this too. It seems a bit of a light touch, really. I think at the moment, the government currently takes into account, was it up to $186,000 of property wealth? So if you live in a $4 million house, you get the same subsidy as someone who lives in a very modest flat.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to the reason for a task force to reform aged care funding, because it speaks to the equity
more user
of the
pays
system.
For those who can afford to.
Well, I think we need a system that people feel like they've got a choice about where they go, and if they have the means to pay for it, they can do so.
And should do so?
In the same way that I've made sure in the terms of reference that there is a safety net, so people who do not have means will still have options, choice.
Yeah, options and choice are important, but I guess my question is, will you require those who have wealth to use it?
I think it's too soon to say what the Aged Care Task Force will recommend to government.
Okay.
But I think what people have told me, I mean, my test here is not just what do people come and meet with me in Parliament about aged care proposals. It's also about what people tell me outside the IGA on a Saturday morning in Lily, and they have made very clear to me that they want more options, they're prepared to pay for higher quality care, but they can't find it. So my job is to create the policy settings that allow those things to be built so people can find it.
I want to ask you about some of the workforce challenges. You've said this is the biggest challenge right now in aged care. Now, Labor promised all aged care facilities would have a registered nurse on deck 24/7 from July 1, so just a few weeks from now. You've even made this a legal requirement. But as this deadline approaches, we know some providers are struggling, and they're now being told, look, as long as you can show you're genuinely trying, that's okay. So a simple question, when will this promise be fulfilled?
As soon as I can possibly muster it.
When's that?
David? Well, like you say, workforce shortages are the #1 issue in aged care. That's not new. Like I said at the National Press Club, that was the #1 issue for mum in the early 2000s. And it's also not just us in Australia. We are in global competition for care economy workers. The ageing population is a issue being faced by every single rich country across the globe.
Sure, we've known this for a long time. You guys set this deadline, you made it a key election promise.
Yes.
So when's it going to happen? Could it be another 12 months?
I think it speaks to the seismic shift happening in the sector at the moment. Yes, we legislated it within months of coming to Parliament because we wanted people to understand that we were going to go about aged care differently. And yes, I've admitted for some months we're going to fall short 1 July.
So when is it now looking? Could it be July next year?
Well, what will happen come 1 July when the legislation kicks in and people are required to provide nursing 24/7, and like you say, where people aren't able to do so, they will still have to tell Janet Anderson, our regulator, that they have alternative care arrangements in place, and she will have to be satisfied with those alternative care arrangements.
Okay, but you're reluctant to put any date on when this will now happen.
Yeah, because like you say, it's a systemic, crippling shortage that we inherited, that other countries like us face, but that shouldn't mean that people have to accept a more feeble standard of care and wait. I mean, I'm sure people are watching us from nursing homes this morning, David. We made that promise. I don't regret making that promise because come 1 July, even where we fall short, there will still be many, many more nurses providing many, many more hours of care in nursing homes than there ever would have been had we not done so.
How many foreign workers will be required to meet these commitments, both the nursing requirement and the 200 minutes per resident per day commitment that has to be met by October?
Well, thousands are required. The aged care workforce as it currently stands is about 50% migrant workers. So that is the environment that we've all been operating in for some time.
Will that be higher as a result of these changes?
I couldn't speak to whether or not that's likely to be the case, just to say that one of the measures that we've put in place is labour agreements, which is a huge development. No Liberal government could ever have done that.
This is to fast-track more migrants into aged care.
It's a tripartite agreement between business, government and unions. The first one that was signed in Perth a few weeks ago now with Minister Giles has 559 workers coming in across a 5-year agreement.
Some immigration experts are worried this is now the fastest way to get a permanent Australian residency. You can come here, do 6 weeks training, work in aged care for 2 years and you can be a permanent resident, right?
The 6-week training, I'm not sure where that's come from. I think that might speak to that Howard era cooks and hairdressers
How much
model.
training would you need to do?
If you are part of a labour agreement coming here, you have either met your Cert 3 qualifications, which is about a 6-month course, or you have 12 months equivalent experience in order to participate in the first place.
Will the government's same job, same pay rules apply in aged care? Because a lot of labour hire is used in aged care.
Agency is a huge issue in aged care, but these labour agreements are a unique beast. They're a massive deal. Minister Giles tells me, because it's strictly his patch, that he's got people queuing out the door of his office to line these up because they achieve for everybody what they need to do.
They pay $51,000 a year for those migrant workers in aged care.
Depending on the agreement and the award and the new 1 July pay rise.
Will it be same job, same pay in aged care?
In the same way that all federal laws apply and the various different awards, that there's 3 that sit under the aged care sector, apply to workers.
So will the migrant workers get the same pay as the Australians?
Yeah, the labour agreements in no way undercut the rigorous labour laws that we have in this country.
The government has now addressed, I think it's 69 recommendations from that Royal Commission. Will the other 79 be implemented, or are there some you now won't proceed with?
There are some that directly contradict one another, like we've already spoken about 2 different proposals about how to reform aged care funding. So it is the case. We're not going to hit 148. They come now really in tranches. So there's sort of another, I want to say, 30, 40 tied up in delivering a new act, which we're hoping to do next year. There's another couple of dozen tied up with delivering a new support at home system. So we will keep working through them, but it is the case that
One of the recommendations was to review the regulator, the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission, to assess whether it's doing its job properly. That review's been done. It's been sitting on your desk for, well, since April, as I understand.
Six weeks, I think.
So when will you release that?
So we've had a read of it. Some of those things are attached to what will be decisions of government in forthcoming budgets. So we will release it, and we'll release it with a government response as soon as I can manage.
All right. And look, a final one just on the issue we're going to talk about shortly. Katy Gallagher, she's denied misleading Parliament when she said, and I quote, "No one had any knowledge about the Brittany Higgins rape allegations." She now says, though, she was made aware. How has she not misled Parliament?
Well, she said that on the night, this set of estimates where this all blew up, that she wasn't answering questions as a minister, she was the person asking the questions in the first place. She's had this interaction with Linda Reynolds, they've taken it offline. They've had a discussion about it. They've put that to one another. Linda Reynolds accepted that at the time, and 2 years on, I accept that now.
But she did say no one had any knowledge, and she did.
I think she said yesterday that she was aware of some things and she didn't act on it, and she didn't do anything with that information. And honestly, David, the political conjecture that has gone on this week about this issue, I find pretty horrifying, and failing to see a really awful forest for the trees. Like, these people who are at this point fairly craven political operators running around having never concerned themselves with answering public interest questions 1 through 86 about what happened here in their government, to now say, braying with urgency, that we need to answer public interest questions 87 through 88, totally beyond the pale in my book, particularly when it comes to Katy Gallagher, who not a soul in Parliament has done more for women and the safety of women, either inside or outside the building, than Katy Gallagher.
Anika Wells, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure.
All right, let's get back to our panel, and we're joined once again by Samantha Maiden, Jacob Grieber and Lenore Taylor. We will get to Katy Gallagher and all of that in a sec. Just on aged care, though, as you heard there, the idea of an aged care levy, something like the Medicare levy perhaps, or some combination of things to find some more money for aged care. All of this is going to be looked at pretty quickly. What are the risks here? I remember at the time of the Royal Commission, some polls were done, and there was actually pretty strong support, it must be said, for the idea of an aged care levy. We're in a cost of living crisis now. Maybe it's a little different. What do you think, Lenore?
I think the government's going to have to handle it carefully, and clearly they're sort of flying kites here and not sort of committing to anything, and we'll probably look at both the reaction to what they're saying and what the task force says. It might be something that they want to float ahead of an election and take to an election because it is a tax rise.
Well, could they do something like they did with the superannuation tax rise, which is legislated in this term, but it doesn't take effect until after the next election? So people can chuck them out if they really
really don't. And they'll probably have to remind people, remember what happened in aged care during the pandemic. Remember what the Royal Commission said. Like, this is a real... They might need to sort of go back to...
some of the horror stories.
Yes, some of the horror stories to sort of convince people that this is something that really needs addressing.
Jacob, the Minister said this is not linked at all to clawing back the stage 3 tax cuts that are going to the top end. Maybe that was a bit of a cheeky question, but if it's a levy, it's still it's a tax. It's a way to claw back some revenue.
100%, and it's interesting. You've got a dynamic, millennial minister who's sort of talking about the need for innovation. But the funding part, if you do a levy, is going to hit a lot of young people right at the time when they're in the maw, with interest rates and cost of living. So there's an intergenerational piece the government's going to have to tackle here. And they'll get a lot of pressure for this from the opposition, naturally. And it's again...
Yeah, the opposition have already said, no thanks.
Yeah, and it's the problem we've got now with our political dynamic. We identify problems in a silo, and then we say the solution is, more tax just to pay for this problem. And we never step back and look at the whole mix of things.
That's a good point.
And that interplay between, yet another levy and what it does on income earners who are in the OECD. The reliance on income tax in Australia is the highest in the OECD. So, OK, we're going to load another load onto that. Oh, and by the way, we want foreign workers to come here and be encouraged to come here, but we're going to tax them all.
Maybe it doesn't have to be a levy. Maybe if we're going to live in I forget the Dutch word for the
Hof or whatever it was.
The collective house we're all going to live in and have a lovely village scene. Maybe we as users pay for that. The user pays.
Hello. I mean, this is going to hit headlong into this sort of intergenerational warfare that is about to spring up in Australia, why should young people who are facing HECS debts and rising interest rates and inflation pay for a levy for the baby boomers to have lava lamps in their old care home? I'm sorry, if they have houses, that it is time that they started paying for it themselves. A lot of these families are very asset rich and they need to look at innovative ways to not force people to sell their houses and everyone carrying on like
the thing is, more people are going to be staying at home anyway.
This is my point. If people are living in some 2 million, 3 million, God knows what house in Sydney, right, what, we're going to put a levy on people that can't buy a house to pay for their aged care?
Right, the sort of ramping up.
Well, this was the whole idea. There was two options, right? One was a levy and one was maybe a levy plus people who are actually getting the services paying more. What a crazy idea.
Maybe a combination of both. And look, the politics of both will be interesting to see. And it's all being done pretty quickly. They're going to have an interim report by October, a final report by December. Let's turn to the Finance Minister, Katy Gallagher, and whether she did mislead Parliament. Here were the comments she made 2 years ago in that exchange in a Senate hearing with Linda Reynolds. It's about whether she knew before the Brittany Higgins rape allegations went to air.
I know where this started. I'm now going to go to Senator Sheldon and give him the call to return to his questioning.
I beg your pardon?
No, Chair.
Order. No, Chair. She's just made an invitation on the Hansard. We'd like to understand what she's just said.
You said I know where this started.
I know where this started. What do you mean?
Senator Wong, I really don't think we should be doing this here, but if you want me to do that.
Yes. I
was told by one of your senators 2 weeks before about what you were intending to do. With the story in my office 2 weeks before.
Oh, I had no knowledge of this.
No one had any knowledge.
Okay.
I had no knowledge of this.
How dare you?
Order. Now we will move.
It's all about protecting yourself.
No one had any knowledge, with the key words there from Katy Gallagher. What's emerged over recent days, text messages between Brittany Higgins and her partner David Shiraz that suggest Katy Gallagher was brought into the loop 4 days before the interview went to air. So here she was, the Minister, yesterday.
Mr Shiraz provided me with information. I think we've seen that in the paper in the last couple of days. I did nothing with that information and I was clear about that at the time. So some 2 years ago, when I spoke with Senator Reynolds about it, I said to her exactly that I had been made aware. I wasn't aware of the full allegations and that were made public when the interviews went to air.
So, Lenore, has Katy Gallagher misled Parliament?
Well, if you take just those 4 words and then look at what we now know, there's a discrepancy there, absolutely. I think Katy Gallagher is saying you need to look at it in the context of that back and forth in the committee, the suggestion that she'd known for weeks, the suggestion that that was where somehow Labor knew where it started, that idea that Labor was sort of behind the whole thing, that's what she was responding to. So this is going to play out in the Parliament. I think the letter of the words suggests there is a discrepancy. Misleading Parliament is important. It should be important. I can't remember the last person who resigned misleading Parliament. We were looking before and we think it might have been John Brown. So
people in the 80s here.
People.
It's become less important.
It has. In practice, it appears to have become less important.
But it should be. It should be important.
And is in state level and is overseas in the UK, for instance.
Boris Johnson. Now, just back to the question though. Looking at what she said then 2 years ago, what she's now saying. Sam, has she misled, do you think?
Yes, I'm going to go where Senator Michaela Cash feared to tread at Sky News. I think it's open and shut that she's misled Parliament. I think that she said no one had any knowledge. How dare you? Well, she did have knowledge. And not only did she have knowledge, I think she's been very resistant to, tell the truth about this because just explain this to us because this is interesting. Yeah, so this issue first was hinted at during the trial where they played a snippet of the audio that has now been leaked, the 6 hours. And on the tape, David Shiraz basically says something to the effect of that he's got a friend in Katy Gallagher who could propel it forward. So after the jury went out, I put in some questions to Katy Gallagher's office in October saying...
This is October last year.
October of last year. Did David Shiraz tell you this? It took me more than a dozen calls, texts, emails to her office over 6 weeks to get a response. And
what was the response?
The response that I got on December the 12th, right, would have put the questions in sort of the end of October, I assume, November. The response I got was, I stand by what I said in the Senate. So she wouldn't answer the question of whether or not David, and so she knows she's got a problem, right? And I also think she's going to get away with it because no one resigns for misleading Parliament. I do think that I do think there's absolutely nothing wrong with her. Well, this it's just a lie, right?
Yeah,
so there's nothing wrong with her dealing with Brittany Higgins. There's nothing wrong with her, she receives information. There's no problem with that. The carry on from the coalition now about where Michaela Cash said weaponisation 600 times on Sky today, they're now weaponising leaked material.
The allegation of weaponising.
But hang on, this is important. Michaela Cash is an officer of the court, right? And she is saying, fair enough, she's a politician, but she is saying, now I want to talk about these text messages that were subpoenaed, that were leaked, that have never been released by the court, and I mean, do you know what I mean? Come on. So both sides are weaponising this.
Yeah, Jacob, misleading Parliament's a problem, but if she did know, is there anything to suggest there was weaponisation or some wrongdoing by Katy Gallagher?
I don't think there's no direct evidence of that, and there's no crime being a politician to talk to someone who's got a big story.
Or ask questions. That's what oppositions do, right?
But I think that, this issue now, it'll play out in the coming week when Parliament returns. How far the opposition goes on this will be an interesting question, but there's red-hot rage on the opposition about this because, from the get-go, this thing was politicised. It was always about more than a criminal matter alone. There was a political overlay to this. It came at a particular period in time with the Me Too movement, and it was turned into an attack on the government of the day and the Prime Minister of the day. For those people, it's fair game now that goes the other way.
What about the leaking of the text messages, the recording of this long pre-interview conversation, all of this material? Sam, who had access to this stuff?
Well, according to the information that has been put before the federal court, because this is an issue that basically Channel 10 sought to have what is called interrogatories. They wanted to question Bruce Lerman about whether or not he knows anything about this. His lawyer made it clear to the court that that was a very grave and serious allegation, that it wasn't true, that he's not involved in that. But ultimately, the judge also didn't want to go forward with the interrogatories. He said it would be a fishing expedition. So who had access to it? Well, the DPP had access, the police had access, the defence lawyers had access. Depending on the material, there were several different iterations of the defence lawyers. at one stage, legal aid was involved. And some or not all of the material would have gone to the Sofronoff inquiry. So it is a large, potential pool of people that could be involved. But it is, it used to be a serious thing, just like misleading Parliament. The Harman principle is that if you receive material under, coercive subpoenas in one court, you can't just hand it out like it's in a chum bucket, which is exactly what's happening now.
And I think there's also a point, going back to what Jake had said, that the central allegation from Brittany Higgins is now not going to be determined in court. But that allegation led to the whole Me Too movement, and that movement was real. And the hundreds of women that came forward and gave evidence in the Jenkins inquiry, and the evidence that came out there of sexual harassment and a terrible culture in Parliament House, and then the changes that happened as a result of that, that was a real moment of reckoning. And I guess I'm just a bit disturbed at the moment that some of this discourse is, it was all just a political thing. That was a real reckoning, and it was a really important moment, and I don't think we should lose sight of that.
But there were also a lot of victims. There were a lot of victims outside the main protagonists. We saw that this week.
And I want to come to that with Fiona Brown too. But just on this Harman principle you mentioned, and look, yes, journalists get leaked stuff, and sometimes there's public interest information in that. But the fact that Brittany Higgins' phone information that she was reluctant to hand over then gets leaked.
But this is
what does this do to other potential complainants?
It would have to have a chilling effect on other complainants coming forward. If you see what happens when you give information to the police, in the course of their investigations. I mean, it has to have a chilling effect.
But this is a complex argument because when we talk about the Harman principle applies to the lawyers and the people that take possession of that, right? As a journalist, if you are leaked that information, well, you're leaked that information. The Harman principle does not apply to you. And I think that there is a public interest in some of the material that has come forward because you can see from my questions to Katy Gallagher last year, I could not get a straight answer out of it. If the Australian hadn't gotten hold of those portion of the text, we wouldn't have gotten to the bottom of the truth of this. So it is a complex area, but I also think that, you know, how can it not be a threat to the administration of justice if a woman or a man hands over their phone as part of a process for this, and then it is somehow mysteriously there's not anybody sitting on this couch, there is not anyone watching at home, that if you got hold of your whole phone, it wouldn't be embarrassing, right? And that it wouldn't be incredibly distressing and
100%,
potentially...
100%. Not to mention a 5-hour conversation. Anyway, but what about Scott Morrison? He's also now been accused of misleading Parliament as well by Fiona Brown, who is... acting as Chief of Staff in the Linda Reynolds office when the alleged rape occurred. She spoke to The Australian yesterday, gave a very detailed and powerful account of how she was thrown under the bus.
And you know,
and suggested that Scott Morrison as Prime Minister misled Parliament when he said he'd spoken to her about this issue.
Yeah, and look, she's obviously one of the sort of, you know, political roadkill on this whole thing, and she's entitled to have her say, and she's done that. And Morrison will have to answer that. You know, and you can interpret what she said about that in a number of ways. You know, he said I spoke to you, so it's either the sort of slightly menacing.
Explain this to people who might not have read it. Fiona Brown, Sam, who was there in the Linda Reynolds office dealing with Brittany Higgins at the time. Scott Morrison gets asked questions in Parliament. Says he had spoken to Fiona Brown. She says he then came back into the office. After he'd said that. He then came back into the office and said...
And says, we talked, right?
When she says they hadn't.
And then she felt really gutted that she thought about it and thought, that made me feel really grubby. Look, I thought it was a really moving account by Fiona Brown, and I have a lot of sympathy for her. And I think part of the tragedy of this is in preparation for this program, I actually went back last night and listened to the original interview that I did with Brittany Higgins in January of 2021. And I was really struck by the fact that, you know, in that article she says Brittany needed to paint me as a villain. I've got to be honest with you, Brittany did not paint her as a villain in that interview with me. Yes, she had concerns about, you know, the sort of feeling that she had about whether she should go forward or not, but she didn't blame that on Fiona. Like, there was no venom towards Fiona. And I know that when I was preparing that story, obviously I went to the Prime Minister's office for comment, but I also texted Fiona Brown, and she sent me a lovely text saying, thank you for your sensitivity, Samantha, in understanding the complexity of this. You know, the villain, there was a villain edit that was done on Fiona Brown later, and I think a lot of that was what happened in Parliament. But I feel like this whole thing has gotten out of control. And it's a tragedy because I think that Fiona Brown did care about Brittany Higgins. Brittany was also a very young person who was in a world of powerful people, and I think sometimes was worried about who knew what and what people really meant when they said things. And I think that, like any workplace dispute, there's been this complete communication breakdown there, and I think that that's a real tragedy. I mean, like, Fiona Brown had problems with what she said in the box, in the witness box, but I just don't think that in the interview that I did with Brittany that she was attacking Fiona Brown at all.
Final aspect to this, Peter Dutton and the Liberals are very keen for the National Anti-Corruption Commission to now look at the settlement payout from the Commonwealth to Brittany Higgins, the opposition leader saying this should be one of their top priorities.
I suspect, given that they can self-initiate processes, that this would be one of the first issues that the Integrity Commission would deal with. I mean, we're talking about multi-millions of dollars here. We're talking about senior ministers of the government potentially having conspired or at least having collaborated with individuals, and a lot of that needs to be explained.
The Attorney-General says this was all done in the very standard way. There were months and months of negotiations over the settlement payout. No problem here. Look, what do you think, Jacob? Is there a case to look at what happened with this compensation payout?
I think these compensation payouts, and Sam can probably talk to this better than me, you know, there's a complexity to them. And so it'll be interesting to see whether that's something the NAC takes on. I think the other thing too is how far the opposition pushes this. because it'll...
Yeah, there are risks there for them.
I think there are risks there for them as well.
Prizing this all open.
This generates another round of political violence, in a sense. And I think just stepping back from it, you talked about the leaking of material. In a quote-unquote standard criminal case, it's far less likely to happen. This has a political overlay. People... I think the community out there is watching this very carefully for the way justice and process is done in this entire case. Because these sorts of things are happening in the community all the time. These allegations are made, people aren't able to defend themselves in what we traditionally think of as a fair court, and it's damaging careers. And I think they're watching this very, very carefully for how this plays out.
In relation to the payout, I think there is so much misreporting of this. You routinely have people say it was a Comcare claim. It was not a Comcare claim. It was a ComCover claim. I think there absolutely should be more transparency and scrutiny about it. Don't get me wrong. I think that's fine. But I think that her lawyers were negotiating that for over a year. You get all these people, particularly on Talkback Radio, saying it was done in one day. Well, generally speaking, you do a mediation when you're ready to do a deal, and that's what happened. But the other thing I think that's worth saying about Peter Dutton when you get into the who knew what and when debate is this. Peter Dutton was, who knew about this before the story broke? Well, Peter Dutton knew about it before the story broke. Why? Because of the sensitive investigation protocol that exists, not his fault. The AFP told him on February the 11th, before I even went to the government, because Brittany had re-engaged with police before the story broke. Now,
we've got to move on. Very, very quickly.
But just very quickly, because it's important. Now, I'm not accusing Peter Dutton of any wrongdoing, right? He didn't do anything wrong. He just was told by the AFP and, that's what he did. But he then did tell the Prime Minister's office that about that approach before the story broke, and there's things that flowed from that.
We're right out of time. We'll come back with some final observations from our panel, Samantha Maiden, Jacob Grieber and Lenore Taylor. Time now, though, for Mike Bowers and Talking Pictures.
I'm Mike Bowers and I'm photographer at large for The Guardian Australia. I'm talking pictures this morning with the one and only Jim Gibson, Anthony Lehman from Utopia. And Utopia's back on.
It is indeed, Mike. We were back last Wednesday at 8 p.m, of course this Wednesday again at 8 p.m. But it is a wonderful thrill to be here. It has been a dream of mine to do Talking Pictures for many, many years.
Anthony, nothing seems to capture the nation's interest like national rates of interest. And this week we got a new high from the inappropriately named Mr. Lowe.
As Jim Gibson on Utopia, when I look at Philip Lowe, it's like I'm looking in a mirror. There is so many characteristics of Jim that I see in Philip Lowe.
He would fit in nicely at the National Building Authority.
He would slot right in. He is as out of touch as my character Jim, and he is as clueless as my character Jim. Jim's motto is a problem passed on to someone else is a problem solved.
And just so I know, who's onto it?
What do you mean who?
What do you mean who? Who's raised it?
We have.
Because of which media?
No media.
I'm lost.
I might be too.
Was this small talk?
The media aren't onto it.
Then what's the problem?
Lovely David Rowe cartoon, A Morning Hike on the Narrow Path. And Jim Chalmers, what happens if you run out of snacks, Phil? Is he's feeding little bite-sized interest rates to the dragon.
And he says, I'm probably not going to be around to find out, Jim.
Well, yes, it's countdown to when he goes under the bus, really, isn't it?
This is the most connected to reality Philip Lowe's ever been.
A lovely David Pope cartoon where he's got Philip Lowe's lighting the I've been patient, but patience has its limits.
Our knight in shining armour, burning down the housing market so it doesn't catch on fire. Yeah. And this is how Philip Lowe would view the Australian mortgage holder as a damsel in distress.
Yeah. Matt Golding has drawn the inflation drag on.
Well, when I first saw this one, I thought, oh, someone's done a cartoon of the RBA board. But no, that'd be 12 dinosaurs sipping champagne.
Fiona Katowskis' dragon seems to have enough time to get a pedicure, and inflation dragon goes into a nail bar.
Oh, everyone worries about interest rate rises, but they really don't affect me at all. And it's so true. I love the dragon getting its nails done, but if this dragon is about to make the most of its time in the spotlight, it might want to fix its teeth too.
Yeah. I did love this Andrew Dyson cartoon. The RBA stands for Reserve Bank Anvil, as he's tossing the spend less and work more.
Another lifeline from the RBA, right there. Here to help.
Here, we're just here to help. If you're struggling with interest rates, work harder.
Work harder. Just a stroke of genius there from Philip Lowe. I'm looking forward to his diet book, Eat Less and Exercise More. Also his marriage guidance, Smile More and Say Yes More. And also, apparently he's going to be coach of the Australian cricket team too, and his main advice there is score more runs.
We've all heard of political football, Anthony, but the Saudis are pioneering political golf.
Saudi Arabia is a half owner of the PGA. It's extraordinary. This would be like if Sarah Hanson-Young turned around tomorrow and joined the Liberal Party.
Lovely Brett Lethbridge cartoon, and that one's been driven out of sight.
Yeah, well, if this drive is anything like my golf, Mike, that moral concern right there is in the bushes somewhere, never to be found again.
This David Rowe cartoon is one of the most brutal I've seen in a long time, holding the bag 90 foot from the hole, as the Saudi gentleman here who seems to have a sabre. What do you think, a wedge or a size 9?
As blood spills all over the fairway.
And a bag full of clubs.
Club feet. Yeah, it really is brutal, but that's the state of play, isn't it? Who was it that said golf is a good walk spoiled? Well, now golf is a moral concern forgotten, I
forgotten
think.
Completely. Finally, AI is seen as a threat to all kinds of jobs. Matt Golding's found one that is as safe as houses. It can answer any questions, therefore it will never replace politicians.
No, well, they could never replace politicians because an AI bot would be way more interesting, would have way more personality. In fact, if you look at what Philip Lowe has said lately, it's like it's been produced by ChatGPT.
Anthony, it's been an absolute pleasure unpicking the events this week, and we can catch you at 8 p.m. on Wednesdays in Utopia.
That's right.
And if not, catch up on iView.
Indeed you can. Can I do the honours?
You can do the honours.
David, back to you in the studio.
Thank you, Anthony. Thank you, Mike. Let's get some final observations. Lenore.
There's been a long history of scathing audit reports into pre-election pork barrelling programs, but the one this week into the former Morrison government's $2 billion community hospitals and health program was blistering even by comparison. In particular, what it said about public servants going along with grants that they knew or had been told were not being given out lawfully.
It did not have a legislative basis and did not meet ethical requirements. Jacob?
There's some very interesting legislation coming to Parliament this week on Nazi symbols. I don't think anyone would disagree. That's a terrible thing, needs to be dealt with, but it'll raise interesting questions. Banning that stuff makes it very hard then to identify some of the most sort of cretinous, terrible people out there.
Yeah, Sam?
Maybe I'm missing something and there's been some secret hearing that I'm not aware of, but it is passing strange, given the events of this week, that the Sofronoff inquiry hasn't been more interested in how this material from Brittany Higgins' phone keeps leaking.
Thank you all very much for joining us this morning. Now, finally, what happens in the confines of the Qantas lounge when political foes run into each other? Well, former Prime Minister Julia Gillard shared this memory with Indira Naidoo on Compass at the time she bumped into Tony Abbott. We'll leave you with that. Thanks for watching.
He walked in and you could feel the whole place.
Yeah.
Like, people, it was breakfast time, people like a cup of coffee halfway to their lips, about to take a little bite of toast, and they're all frozen in the moment. And I thought this could soon degenerate into calls of fight, fight, fight. Like, I've got to do something about this. And I ended up saying something to him like, I know how hard campaigning is, and I, wish you personally well for the weeks to come, but not too well because I want you to lose.
You're making us all feel very excited about being here.